Bonjour, I'm Marie-Monique Steckel, President of the French Institute Alliance Française in New York. Welcome to Liberté d'Expression, Free Speech, and Cancel Culture, a transatlantic festival co-presented by La Maison Française of NYU, the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the US, and FIAF, the French Institute. This second talk of the festival on Saturday the 24th at 1 p.m. is dedicated to sexuality. And it is a pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers, cultural critic and former video artist Laure Kipnis. Now, she is joined by Professor Laure Murat, who specializes in cultural studies at UCLA, French philosopher Manon Garcia, and moderator and journalist Lorraine Wolfe. Now, looking through the lens of sexuality, these four women will help us demystify the questions concerning freedom and its limits. Now, it is sure to be a fascinating talk. Now, if you have any questions for our guests, you can send them via the Q&A in Zoom. Everyone, welcome to FIAF's virtual stage. And thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Monique, and welcome everyone. As Marie-Monique just introduced Laura, you're going to be hearing from her first. Her latest book is actually called Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus. So Laura, thank you, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for this invitation. I'm going to be talking about sexuality and its overlaps with speech and freedom of expression, I think, a bit more than sexuality directly. So here goes. One of the difficulties in talking about cancel culture is, aside from the tendency to fulminate self-righteously, which I'm going to try to avoid, is that you're often attempting to talk about something that's not there, since cancellation is fundamentally about an absence of voices, arguments, pushback in certain cultural spheres, particularly the cultural sphere I operate in as a writer. Let's call it the mainstream liberal cultural sphere. The right has its own issues, which I'll leave to Liz Cheney to sort out. Rather than make a big abstract fulminating argument, I'm going to talk a bit more personally and anecdotally about what things feel like at the moment, about the cultural texture, including about talking about issues of sexuality and all the issues around consent, etc., women's agency. These are things that I've written about throughout my career, and a sense of a cultural narrowing about what's permissible to say about those subjects. So I'm trying to talk about something that's both ephemeral, but also, I think, all important. So I'm genuinely puzzled when I hear people say that cancel culture doesn't exist, since as a left-wing feminist contrarian, sometimes prone to irony, I've been feeling cancel culture yapping at my heels for a while now, and a couple of times biting off small hunks of flesh. From where I sit, this ethos pervades just about all cultural and educational institutions I have any contact with. And I should pause to explain a little about my employment situation, since for many of us, these are livelihood concerns, not just abstract matters of principle. In addition to being someone who writes books and essays, often on the subjects of sexual politics, I also operate in the university context. I'm a professor at Northwestern where I teach filmmaking, so okay, sort of a pseudo-academic. And that was where the trouble started for me. I should specify in advance that whatever troubles I've had have been minor compared to many others, and I don't want to sound either self-aggrandizing or self-pitying. This is more like a report about conditions on the ground lately from one narrow and self-interested perspective. I honestly never thought that much about freedom of expression. I thought these were settled matters until a few years ago when I wrote a somewhat ironic essay about the rise in campus sexual paranoia, speaking from my standpoint as a left-wing feminist. I took a somewhat mocking tone about the new regulations prohibiting student-professor relationships, pointing out that you could barely throw a stone on most American campuses without hitting a professor married to a former student. Were these marriages now to be deemed illicit? So the first sign of trouble was that 30 or so students staged a protest march against me, marching to the president's office, which is certainly their right if we're talking about free expression. But soon after, I was also officially brought up on Title IX complaints by 2 students and charged with creating a, quote, hostile environment on campus. For those who are unfamiliar with it, Title IX is a US federal code designed to address gender discrimination and sexual assault in educational institutions. A couple of students decided to weaponize it into punishment for ideas they objected to and ideas about sexuality. Could I be fired for writing an essay? It wasn't clear. I'm lucky enough to be tenured, but such job protections are shrinking. Half the professors in the country are now not on tenure lines. After a 72-day investigation conducted by a team of outside lawyers hired by the university, I was eventually found not guilty. I then wrote a sort of expose about the experience titled My Title IX Inquisition, detailing how weird this secret accusation process had been to go through. My going public didn't stop the same students, now joined by a gaggle of professors, my colleagues, in other words, from other departments than mine, from bringing Title IX complaints against me once again, this time after I wrote a book about the overreaches of Title IX called Unwanted Advances. These strange episodes launched my side career as a somewhat diffident free speech advocate. More recently, my partner, a funny and sometimes intemperate left-wing history professor, was brought up on charges of discrimination and harassment by the good liberals in the HR department of his university for a satirical Facebook post he'd written announcing his resignation from the white race. He posted, quote, "I now officially hate white people, and for God's sake, I am a white people." He thought this was social commentary and assumed no one would take this literally, especially given the grammar. The HR crowd, being literalists, charged him with and then pronounced him guilty of, quote, reverse racism, unquote, which as an American historian, he argued doesn't exist. The president of the university eventually intervened, but it was touch and go as far as his employment situation for a while. And I'm refraining from naming him or his university because he was also hounded by white supremacists for a year, which was no fun. So if you're keeping count, that's 3 university investigations in one couple so far. I called myself a diffident free speech advocate because I do still believe that actual hate speech has no place on campus, though obviously the problem with putting the power to define it in the hands of campus bureaucrats is that they're often idiots. As I say, other people have far worse stories than these to tell, career-ending stories, so we got off lucky for our various speech crimes. So all of this was more or less on my mind when I was asked last summer to sign the now notorious Harper's letter on justice and open debate, which I did despite my general antipathy to boilerplate liberalism. But the Harper's letter also alluded to editors being fired for running controversial pieces, and the allusion was obviously to Ian Baruma, who had been my own editor at the New York Review of Books, which was once a legendarily risk-taking publication. Following that tradition, Baruma ran a risky essay by the disgraced Canadian radio host Jian Ghomeshi, who'd been accused of sexual violence by numerous women, though acquitted in court. The essay reflected on the experience of being canceled. Perhaps it wasn't the world's greatest essay. There's no doubt that editorial Baruma misread the moment, which dictates that those accused of sexual assault are immediately canceled, even if acquitted. And the acquittal was itself controversial. Cancel culture dictates that those who give those accused people a platform risk the same fate, which hadn't been previously announced. I don't think Baruma was aware of this. After much Twitter outrage on the one strike and you're out principle that is cancel culture's signature achievement, Baruma was sacked by the New York Review publisher who'd previously signed off on the piece. Knowing it would be a self-inflicted professional wound, but unable to stop myself, I wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times objecting to the firing and expressing the fear that no sane editor would ever again dare run anything controversial and cultural life would suffer. I was, of course, dropped from the august roster of the New York Review of Books writers, and they also somehow neglected to run the final piece Buruma had commissioned from me. Part of the reason I'm returning to this episode is nostalgia. Even as recently as 2.5 years ago, A, the Times was willing to run such a piece, though only online ultimately, and B, I still had a sort of bravado back then about standing up for my principles and saying what I thought when given the chance. As a result of doing that, those chances have definitely narrowed. And if I'm going to be honest, I have to admit that in response, I'm far more cowed and second guessing than I used to be about taking such stands. Mainly because what I wrote in the op-ed turned out to be quite true. Following Buruma getting canned, editors are palpably terrified, or that's my experience. But how to demonstrate that? It goes back to the difficulty I raised at the start, the problem of talking about what's not there. I can only report, and I hear this constantly from fellow writer contrarians, that magazine and newspaper editors in legacy media, in online media, all over the place, have circled their wagons or pulled up the drawbridges or whatever the appropriate idiom for being terrified is, and what's sayable or culturally permissible in mainstream publications, including the ones that used to be freewheeling and controversial, have radically narrowed. Editors are cultural gatekeepers, and risks are not being taken. The muzzles are out and being pretty freely applied, even at the level of the sentence, and particularly when it comes to matters about sexuality. To talk about sentences is maybe a bit insider baseballish, but as both a writer and a reader or a cultural consumer, sentences matter to me a lot. And in retrospect, if I'd been smarter, I'd have seen Buruma's fate coming earlier because of an argument over a sentence. Buruma had commissioned me to write one of the early think pieces that took up the issues generated by Metoo back in fall 2017 when it was all just breaking. The occasion was a book about sexual harassment by Gretchen Carlson, the former Fox newscaster who brought down Roger Ailes, the sexual monster who ran Fox News. I was at that time a Me Too enthusiast, and in a different way still am, but I was exhilarated and wrote that we were in the midst of a radical uprising, and that if women's bodies were still being treated as property at this late date, another reign of terror was long overdue. If women were stuck with the job of overthrowing aristocratic privilege a few hundred years late, it was because this social stratum needed to be liquidated before all the genders could achieve civic and economic equality. I believe I cited Gramsci. But I also questioned a story Carlson told about an experience at one of her early jobs where she was riding alone in a car with a cameraman who suddenly launched into a discussion about how much he'd enjoyed touching her breasts when he'd put a microphone under her blouse. Carlson said her response was sheer terror. She started shaking and contemplated jumping out of the moving vehicle. Once back at the office, she was trembling so badly her boss noticed and asked her what had happened. Feeling sick to her stomach, she told him. I asked in the piece what had stopped Carlson from just telling the cameraman to shut up. He wasn't her boss, he hadn't threatened her, though granted he was being gross. I added that if he fondled or kissed her against her will, he certainly should have been severed from his paycheck. I have a view, maybe not a conventional one, about mainstream American feminism, which is that the relentless focus on female endangerment, more so than, say, emancipation or resource redistribution, is a backdoor route to reinstalling traditional femininity, and it's disempowering. I wrote a book arguing this in around 2007, so it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. During the editing process, Buruma told me that it would make his life much easier if I'd add a line, which he supplied to me, saying that, of course, Carlson was a young woman in her early 20s and recently hired, and the guy was out of line to explain her terror. By make his life easier, I inferred that he was getting internal pushback about the piece, and I agreed to the addition, even though it was an obvious and banal line designed to appease any ruffled feathers, and weakened my argument, which was that jumping from a moving vehicle because a man was being gross was an hysterical reaction. Yes, he was guilty of harassment, certainly, but not being able to tell the difference between smutty talk and a potential assault is a failure of intellect. And for better or worse, I was the one whose opinions were supposed to be represented in this piece and whose byline this dumb added sentence was going to appear under. It's a minor episode, but I think a telling one, and an intimation of what would eventually lead, I suspect, to Buruma being sacked, which is that he was bad at, and I guess I'm equally bad at, what sometimes gets called virtue signaling. We're all now meant to signal on an ongoing basis, sentence by sentence, that we feel and think the right things, and only the right things on certain sensitive subjects, and to restate the obvious as often as possible to signal our allegiance to the prevailing pieties. This is what I mean by cultural narrowing, or to be more blunt, dumbing down. And it's not that there isn't good writing at the moment, there is, but there's also a uniformity of thought and opinion that's simply stultifying. Anyway, these various episodes were in the back of my mind when I said yes to signing the Harper's letter, at least after they took out some language that I thought was gratuitous left bashing. And unlike a lot of people who blame so-called cancel culture on the left, as if the left were one thing, I myself don't believe this stuff is leftism. If you want to assign it a spot on the political spectrum, I'd call it neoliberal wokeness, or the theology of HR departments and their expanding bureaucratic purviews. There's nothing progressive about rote sanctimonies. Once again, misreading the moment, I never thought the Harper's letter would cause any kind of stir. Everything in it seemed exceedingly obvious. It was simply a defense of democracy. But if it was good enough for Noam Chomsky, I figured I could sign it too. After it came out, I got contacted by a mainstream liberal publication asking me to write a piece on why I'd signed the letter, which I obediently wrote, also touching on the J.K. Rowling controversy. Many in the trans community had decried the Harper's letter as anti-trans because Rowling, who'd been making offensively transphobic remarks around that time, was a signatory. Some of my trans friends had announced on Facebook that they were unfriending friends who'd signed it. Not wishing to be unfriended, online or off, I replied to the Facebook discussion explaining that no one had known who the other signatories would be aside from Chomsky, and I tried to give some of my own reasons for signing the letter. What follows is a bit of credential touting, for which I apologize, but I felt on the defensive after this letter and was trying to signal that I'm nothing if not a queer ally. I mentioned that I'd been one of the early feminists to write favorably about pornography back in the 1990s, which meant breaching the intellectual orthodoxies of the moment, both left and right. That work did, I think, help open space in and out of the academy for further discussions and activisms around sexuality and queerness. Porn studies has now become a respectable academic field, but back then it meant enduring the moral arm twisting of anti-porn feminists who accused me and others writing favorably about porn of fostering violence against women, not to mention all the conservative male professors who thought porn wasn't a fit academic subject and militated against my getting tenure. My point wasn't that I was silenced, it was that I've spent my career attempting to evade the pieties of all sides, and the freedom to do that has shriveled immensely. The intellectual policing is unbelievable, and all the more for anyone who's professionally and intellectually precarious. How do you risk challenging orthodoxies under the current conditions when any perceived misstep invites a public stoning? I was alluding to an untenured assistant philosophy professor named Rebecca Tuval, who wrote a 2017 article for a feminist philosophy journal, juxtaposing as a thought experiment, which is something philosophers do, the transgender identity of Caitlyn Jenner and the so-called transracialism of Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman who identified as Black. Duval was arguing that some of the prevailing assumptions in trans theory are self-contradictory. Additionally, many of supposedly progressive ideas about race are fairly racist when you dissect their underlying essentializing assumptions. Critics of the article circulated a petition signed by over 800 academics calling for the article to be retracted. Duval was deemed a racist, a transphobe, and worse, and her tenure prospects were threatened. Clearly, she was raising questions people didn't want raised. If they weren't important questions, they'd have been ignored. I'm not sure what was worse, the savagery or the groupthink. People who fear trans women sexually assaulting other women in ladies' locker rooms, as J.K. Rowling has written, are, I believe, hysterics. But should I risk ostracism myself by saying that? Duval, who is completely in favor of trans rights, as am I, raised what I think are legitimate questions about the essentialist elements in some prevailing trans and race theories and what the implications are. These are now verboten questions on campus. If you raise them, your job will be threatened, as Duval's was. Raising them in my piece, the commissioned piece about the Harper's letter, turned out to be verboten too. The piece was, as they say, spiked, meaning it was accepted, then didn't run. I got paid, which was something, but it seemed ironic to be asked to write a piece about cultural censorship that's then quashed. I hesitate to say censored. I was told unofficially that a group of different editors read it and all wanted different changes to be made, but no one could agree on what they should be, which I think speaks to the uncertainty of this moment. No one wants to incite Twitter mobs, but no one knows what will set them off, so err on the side of playing it safe. The result, more and more cultural homogeneity. I've been thinking about these subjects prior to the Harper's letter because I'd written another piece based on a talk I'd been asked to give on the West Coast on the subject of democracy and ethics. In this paper, I'd mentioned the Duval case in trying to talk about the distinctions between politics and identities. Knowing that I was making a slightly incendiary argument, and with the Duval petition in mind, I'd asked a trans friend to read the piece and give me feedback. I assumed one of the places I'd published at previously would run it, but no editor at the 3 left liberal publications I approached would touch it. One editor I usually email with would only discuss it on the phone, clearly afraid that anything they said in print might circulate. And I'm using gender neutral pronouns because I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, and I would like to write at these places in the future. They said they were too afraid of the blowback if they ran it, meaning Twitter. Another editor and I met for lunch, Dutch, where they said they wanted to run it, but were overridden in-house. But they were recommending the piece to another editor friend at another big publication. This editor wrote me back within 10 minutes of me contacting them, which is sort of unprecedented, to say how eager they were to read it, and then radio silence. The whole thing was almost poignant because these editors were terrified, including people who'd once happily run risky and controversial material. As I said at the start, it's difficult to figure out how to talk about what's not there, what we're not reading in the liberal mainstream sphere. If you want to be published, you conform to the sanctimonies of the moment. And I should add, I share many of the political goals of the cancel culture architects. I'm for racial and economic justice, gender equality, trans rights. For those reasons, I'm not someone who wants to publish in right-wing places, though believe me, they're eager to pick off leftists they think might be vulnerable to their siren songs, eager to demonstrate that they're the ones carrying the torch of liberty and that the left has given up on democracy. To state the obvious, as a writer, I'd like to be able to question verities, mock sanctimonies, and even sometimes make a mistake in print or on social media without fearing destitution will be the consequence. Since that's not possible at the moment, self-censorship is the new norm, and everyone knows it. I'm doing my best at it. Even as I recognize that there's no free marketplace of ideas, I'm still not sure why less cultural, intellectual freedom is what anyone really wants. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Laura. I'd been planning on trying to sum up what you said, but I think you touched on so much that I'm not able to do that. I will just say you are a firebrand and have been at the center of so many scandals and controversies around this. I didn't put it all together until I heard you say them. But as someone who was recently considered, canceled, I just wanted to respond a little bit and then open up to Manon and Laure. for those of you who don't know, the quick story was I worked at the New York Times for the last year. And then in January, I tweeted something that to me was apolitical. We'd just seen our country go through the nightmare of the lies about the recount and all of that. And I was covering the election at the New York Times every day. And I felt like when democracy finally worked and Biden was coming to the White House, I felt very moved by that, by the reinstatement of reality. So I just went on Twitter and I just did a simple tweet like Biden's landing, wherever he was landing. And, I have chills. That's all I said. Not, I want to marry Mr. Biden. I think he's the best man ever. And that night I had the right come at me, although Glenn Greenwald did as well. So it's all just sort of a jumble politically, The New York Times fired me instantly. I wasn't given any kind of hearing. I mean, it was basically like, sorry, that's it. I then became a strange symbol between the right and the left of like, the New York Times is a bunch of idiots. And like now the super lefty liberals, they started to claim me as some sort of symbol, right? The right people are screaming at me. I don't even know how to parse it anymore. I just know that as someone who was canceled, all I could think was I was being offered jobs. I'm still sitting here working. I am very privileged. I don't believe in cancel culture in that sense. Like, I don't understand what you mean. You can't just throw away people because you don't like what they said, or you think it's funny, or they're being mocked. But hearing you talk about it from more of like an intellectual academia perspective and like culture writing perspective, I am seeing that how you can be edged out. I was in more of a news position, so it wasn't sort of an issue with us. We just were supposed to pretend that we didn't feel anything, right? One of the things I wanted to start on then is what exactly cancel culture means to each of you. And since we're going to be talking about, the differences in France and the US, I'd be super interested to hear which end of the political spectrum you feel it's mostly falling on, because it does seem to keep crossing lines as far as I'm concerned. People on the right, at least in my case, were very, very happy to shout gleefully at me that I was canceled. So, but your argument, Laura, is more nuanced about the left. So I would like to just ask to start, Manon and Laure, for each of you to just tell us a little bit about what your experience of cancel culture is, how you define it, and if you see differences between the two countries in the way it's being thrown about and perceived.
So, hi, thank you very much. And thank you, Laura, for your talk. It was very interesting. So I'm in a specific situation, I guess, because I'm a French philosopher trained in France, but I now work in the US, and I happen to be what is called a resident tutor at Harvard. So I live in the dorms with undergrads, and I'm the person in charge of consent and sexuality in the house. So I guess I have a particularly clear idea. I'm not affiliated with the Title IX office, and we could talk about this, but I'm also a feminist philosopher, and so I've been following very closely the whole Tubel affair that Laura Kipnis mentioned. So I think it's very interesting, because right now my experience of cancel culture is much more, especially as a French academic, is much more what's going on right now in France with the term Islamo-gauchisme, so Islamo-leftism. So now the president of France and the Minister of Education and the Minister of Higher Education are saying these people who work on feminism, on intersectionality, on colonial studies, they're threatening what France is, and they're somewhat responsible for Islamic terrorism that is going on in France, and therefore they should not be paid by public money because they're entering what France is. So it's true that when I'm told about cancel culture, I feel like, well, we are the people being canceled right now. And that brings me to think something a bit wider, which is that I don't think it's something that is happening necessarily now, that people are trying to cancel their adversaries. I think it's always been the case. I think when you look at the 70s, there's always been the leftist, that you were not leftist enough, or that you were not leftist the right way, and the right wing were trying to cancel the intellectuals from the left wing. And so I'm not sure that there's been less freedom of expression. Actually, I think there, especially on American campuses, there's really a discussion about what is freedom of speech. I mean, I worked at University of Chicago before, and it was a very important issue constantly. Who are the speakers that are allowed to be here? So I think I feel like I agree with Laura that it's something that is very hard to talk about, something that we can't see, that we can't grasp, that something that is not there. But I'm very skeptical of this argument of cancel culture, because I think the people who have been canceled mostly are the people who are not the elite. And I'm not sure now. I feel like some people who belong to the elite, who are in position in good universities like I am, are upset that people that have less power than them are gaining power in the conversation, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a bad thing.
Laura?
Yes, I fully agree with Manon, and especially on the Islamo-gauchism that we are just the victim of right now. I would like just to remind that censorship is something that the state is allowed to do. Censorship is an official rule in a way that only the state can do. I regret that cancel culture is named cancel culture, because, you know, no one is really completely canceled. It's not completely true. As you know, it was replaced, you know, by some people by accountability culture, and just, you know, saying that you are responsible of what you're saying. You know, you have to pay the consequences of what you're saying, basically. And I would like to remind that cancel culture, as we have probably the same definition, is a very old way of protesting. It's not very new. I mean, it's disguised in new, but, you know, it is boycott. Boycott is a political right. It's whistleblowing, specifically in the case of sexual harassment, for instance, or it can be a way of protesting, demonstrating, like when you have toppling of state statues, you know, all over America and the rest of the world, by the way, since George Floyd murder. So for me, it's a new expression for an old action and an old way of saying we do not agree. We respectfully or not respectfully dissent, right? So that's one thing that I think. Of course, it's always very complicated to talk about cancel culture in general, because on campus it has a specific, you know, meaning and embodiment, if I may say so. Of course, there is the problem of Title IX. Of course, there is a problem of confidentiality when the professor who is accused cannot have access to his or her dossier, which is just unbelievable, in my opinion. The problem of the university, if we want to drive the conversation in that area or not, the problem of the university, in my opinion, is to make the university at the same time a safe space for students who feel under pressure because of hierarchical power relationships, which is, you know, the professor has the power and the students. The students can be provocative, the student can be whatever. There is a hierarchical relationship, a power relationship that cause problems. Okay, that's one thing. And students feel pressure because, of course, if he or she doesn't do this or that with this professor, he can, you know, be deprived of a letter of recommendation, et cetera, et cetera. So you have many consequences. How to make, if we want to zoom out a little bit, you know, in the topic, how to make the university or the campus a safe space, but not necessarily a comfort zone. which is very complicated. Comfort zone, meaning that you have to have a free discussion with the students. Now, I agree that, we reached a level where it's sometimes quite difficult to make an argument without offending people, which is problematic. It is a problem. I acknowledge that, no problem. But again, we have to, why cancel culture now? Although it's an old way of protesting. Why it's so important now? I think many people, and Manon said it, many powerless people are fed up. They're just fed up. They don't know how to protest, they are powerless, and they have one instrument which is extremely strong, which is the internet and the social network. We have to remind that the fiercest enemy of cancel culture is Donald Trump. And I think that there is something mirroring here, because Donald Trump is a canceller. I don't know if you can say that in English, but he is someone who does cancel culture all the time, who has the power to do that. So there is something that the mob is mirroring the most powerful man in the world, right? Mirroring in the fact that we oppose the will of one person. And you know what he said about sexual harassment, always deny, okay? Always deny. When Placido Domingo, whom I love as a singer, who's a beautiful singer, is accused of sexual harassment, who is canceled? He canceled many divas during his career, many divas who couldn't get roles at the opera because they didn't want to have sex with him. So the question is, who is canceling whom? And again, censorship, we have to understand. And here you ask also about, and then I will stop. You ask the difference between the United States and France, and I think it's the liberté d'expression and freedom of speech are not the same because of the law. The law is not the same in France and in the United States. My third, just quickly, assumption is that probably we reach a time, a level, a momentum where the rules of the debate have to be reshuffled. We have to rethink the great legacy of enlightenment, of how to organize a debate, not what it is forbidden or allowed, but how we can speak again to each other,
right?
To talk again.
I'm sorry. Because you talked about this is not new, this is almost a reincarnation or a new interpretation. I wanted to ask you all, and maybe Laura, particularly for you, because I'm thinking of the kind of mid-90s PC debate, wars, culture. How does this relate to that? Is it really coming out of the same kind of tradition of trying to make sure nobody goes too far on things? I can't tell when you say it's repeating. Let's talk a little more about that. What's repeating? You're muted.
Were you asking me or Laura?
I was asking you. I'm sorry, there's Laura,
Sure.
and me. So
Exactly.
You, Laura, as an American in that time.
I mean, I would slightly take issue with what Laura says about I think you weren't exactly saying it's always been the same, but the difference, I think, in the 90s, and it's not, we're not talking about state censorship, of course, but the role of institutions is incredibly different now. The institutions are stepping in and oftentimes at the behest or following behind the Twitter mobs. And, this raises or kind of presses on something that Manon raised about and I think both of you did, Laura and Manon, about the powerless kind of rising up and being fed up and using the mechanisms at their disposal, which is the internet. you know, what's the difference between like a mob, a Twitter mob, you know, in which it's arguments are not being made. I mean, we're certainly not on the terms of the Enlightenment, and most of these people are anti-Enlightenment. I mean, there's certainly, you know, there's a lot of protest against just the very idea of free and open kind of debate and discourse. You know, so anyway, that's just what I would say briefly is the difference. I mean, you could protest against or write a piece against some, you know, like when I was attacked or maligned by anti-porn feminists, my job wasn't at stake. Now, your job is at stake. The institutions, whether it's the publishing industry or the universities, are yanking people's jobs away, and you know, canceling is for real.
Can I just ask you a question from someone in the audience named Gabriel Laverdiere? You just raised it yourself, and all of us have sort of been circling it. Would there be any cancel culture if there weren't Twitter?
But I'm not sure. I think we're talking about so many different things under the same term, cancel culture, because there's one issue that I think Laure and I agree on, which is the bureaucracy of Title IX. There is a problem on American campuses after the Dear Colleague letter of 2011 that now universities.
Can you just tell people what that is a little bit?
Yeah, so basically the Obama administration increased the responsibility of colleges in the evaluation and how do you say, like,
adjudication.
Yeah, the adjudication of sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, sexual assault. And the problem is that basically if you want to receive federal funding, you need to report how much sexual assault there is on your campus. And this sort of reporting bureaucracy is such that the rules of law do not apply. So it's not what happens in court. You have a lot of protections for the accused people in courts in France and in the US, but there is this sort of bureaucracy on American campuses where the rule of law does not apply like on other normal courts. And so you can be accused of something and you don't know what you're accused of. You don't know if you're gonna be given due process. Sometimes you won't be given due process. There is a problem with Title IX. The problem is that where I disagree with Laure Kipnis, for instance, is that I don't think that it's that the fact that there are problems with the bureaucracy of Title IX means that it's wrong to adjudicate what is going on in power relations between professors and students, for instance. I don't think, I think it's a bit saying, well, there are cases where there's something like a witch hunt in Title IX investigations to draw the conclusion from this that it's wrong to think that professors should not have sex with undergrads or things like that. Like, I think these are two different questions. But I think we all agree that there is a problem with the way Title IX administration works. But this is completely different from what is going on Twitter. The fact that on Twitter, some people post jokes or post offensive things, and sometimes it gives them tons of followers, and sometimes it gives them like a storm of hatred, is something that has to do with social network. But this is not the same thing as Title IX. The problem is, of course, when universities say, well, you said this on your social network, and you know, like you have on Twitter, you have a lot of people who say this is only my views and not the views of my employer, as if you would be like taken to hold the views of your employer when you tweet. Like, everyone knows that you don't. But the very fact that some people feel like they have to say it, and I think Lauren, you were a victim of that like you could say, oh, look at Air Force One, and suddenly like it's seen as the New York Times is a bunch of leftists that should die. I don't know, but
I certainly got enough death threats because of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's also like these are two different issues, and I think there are power dynamics, and so I think what is very troubling with cancel culture is that you have a power of the number against a power of position. Like Rebecca Tuvel, she just got tenure. She's the chair of her department. She got crazy support from her university every year since the scandal happened. And I mean, I think that's great. I think we can disagree on this particular paper, but she does good work, and it's great that she's supported, but she's not a weak person that is sleeping outside. She's a chair of a philosophy department in a good college. And so, yes, then you had a lot of adjunct graduate students, etc., who were a big number on social network and said, we want justice. This person didn't engage with the literature that is not taken seriously, but where people have been working on these issues for years. How did she think that she was not held to the standard of reading the people she was talking about, etc.? So it's a very complex story, but there is a thing where people with power and privilege suddenly are exposed to accountability from a mass of people on social network, and that's very bizarre. And I'm not saying that's good whatsoever, but I'm saying also that there used to be a time where being in a classroom was, I remember in France taking philosophy courses where I was told, where the professors were always taking examples of like, oh yeah, you see this woman with big boobs who work in the street, and and you really want her, and you're like, how am I going to talk to her? And oh yeah, and they were making like sex jokes all the time. And I mean, yeah, I was not traumatized by this, but it constantly felt like women were not part of the philosophy community. Women were objects of desire for philosophers. And so what does it make you when you're a woman who wants to be a philosopher? Like, it's true that this happened. It's true that you, like, as someone who did my studies in France, professors didn't have their door open when you were going to their office. And sometimes, like I had professors who talked to me about how good I smelled, and I had to pass them very close when I had to open the door. And Laura, when you say yes, sometimes they're like when you take the example of the cameraman, etc., I think you're not taking seriously the fact that there are good reasons to be scared of men when you say no to men. I mean, you may not have experienced this, but it happened to me to be catcalled in the street and to respond and to be strangled and to be put on the ground and strangled. And I thought I was really going to die. And I was hit, like it happened in the street. I was 16, And so women know also that men know to put them back in their place. And you have stories in France, like it happened again. I know someone to whom it happened recently to be raped in the metro in Paris during the day. And at some point, we have to not say this is women that are feeling like they're victims when they don't respond to men being like sexually improper with them.
Can I just to get us back a little bit toward, I mean, I appreciate we all have different views on this, and it's super important as a discussion, but just to get back to the idea of cancel culture and relating it to being a woman, can any of you
respond for one moment? Since I think I'm being views are being attributed to me that I don't hold. I mean, just to be clear, I wrote a book, the last book I wrote on Unwanted Advances about the Title IX process, and trying to inject some nuance into the discussion. I mean, I'm certainly not a fan or in favor of quid pro quo harassment or harassment of any sort, or certainly not rape or sexual violence. I mean, this is part of the problem of, trying to talk in a more nuanced way about these things. Of course, I'm appalled by, rape and sexual violence and would do anything to protest against them. But, it's part of what we're talking about here is I think a kind of hysterical reaction to, and this goes back to the discussion topic of sex, that sex has itself, discussions of sex or sexual talk has become a very fearful kind of sight at this moment. I mean, that's maybe a longer discussion, but
I read your book, you know. I don't think I'm misconstruing anything that
you are
saying.
Actually.
I read your book very carefully. I think
before we go too far, just on
I just want to say something because I think it's important. I think it's a problem to say that anyone who opposes your view is hysterical, schizophrenic, paranoid. You say this constantly. Like, I agree with you about Title IX. Oh yeah, you use the term schizophrenic.
Can we just hold on, Manon? I really just, I want to bring us back. Like, I understand you two are disagreeing, and you can disagree for the rest of your lives, but I want to make sure we get back a little bit on topic. We have some questions from the audience, and I'm interested. A lot of you are asking questions about freedom of speech in campus. And earlier we had a question for you, Laure, that you had mentioned liberté d'expression. I don't know, I'm saying it wrong. I'm saying it like half Spanish. I'm sorry, my French is terrible. And the difference between the US and in France. And I know, at least in terms of journalism, defamation laws are a lot stricter over there in Europe in general, that hate speech is more regulated or regulated at all. But I'm wondering if you can answer this question. They would like to know the difference between the two. And I still want to get back to all of you. I want to hear what you think about cancel culture and just the differences between being a woman and a man in this moment. But that's for after. So Laure, if you could just tell us a little about the differences. Yeah.
The differences between France and the United States regarding
in terms of freedom of expression and use the different laws and just the way it's.
Yes, so for instance, we have a law in France called La Loi Guessot, and it is forbidden to make anti-Semitic comments. Well, I mean, I make a long story short, but you know, that's an example. In the United States, you don't have such things, but you have, and I think we didn't talk about it, or I missed it, about you have kind of a moral orthopedia, which is called political correctness. So for a long time now, you cannot say the N-word unless you want really to have issues, right? So it's completely different, completely, because in France, la liberté d'expression is more or less regulated. It doesn't prevent many problems. And in many ways, French people are way more, what can I say, bold? I don't know, I'm not sure it's the right word, but you know, more provocative about that, about homosexuals, about, you know,
sex itself.
Yeah. So for instance, in my case, when I came to the United States at UCLA 15 years ago, I was extremely pleased to see precisely this safe space where we were not, you know, aggressed by sexist comments, by, you know, sexual, you know, innuendos, etc., etc. I think it was, for me at least, kind of a relief, because there is a you know, an unsaid rule, political correction, not everywhere, but you know, in the major body of, I mean, at least at the university, just not to fight with this and to create a viable environment. But the other problem, I'm sorry, I'm deriving a little bit from your question, but the other problem is the problem which is specifically American in my opinion, which is liability management. Mm-hmm. Instead of addressing the problem in a very straightforward way, as probably French people would do, and with some kind very brutal, they can be very brutal. In the United States, because you want to, you know, contourner, I don't know how do you say that, you know, just, you know,
make everything nice for everybody and hold responsibility.
Yes, you know, not to go straight to the obstacle, but, you know, bypass the obstacle. You're going to say, well, you know, and liability management, the result of liability management is that you protect the institution and not the victims. That's the main problem.
Is that a little bit, Laura, I heard you saying something like that. I thought, Laura. I thought I heard you say something a little bit along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues in discussing some of this stuff is that these things are kind of code words, you know, like words like safe space or accountability, I mean, are code words for adopting certain sets of views. You know, like when we talked about Tuval and there's this idea she should be accountable. I mean, accountable means in that context, she adopted views that weren't the views that people wanted her to have. And the same thing with safe space. I mean, you've got students who confronted with ideas that they don't like or that are feather ruffling will, you know, use terms about words like injury or, you know, press grievances or argue with professors who assign things on a syllabus that's in the professor's area of expertise that the students think, you know, contain views that are not of this moment or not the right kind of progressive. So, you know, safe space and accountability, like I said, are code words for, I think, stifling and shutting down exchanges of views that an Enlightenment tradition, to go back to what Laure brought up, would say, you know, should be open discussions, at least, open to debate.
I'm waiting for any of you. I mean, every comment brings so much into this conversation. That's why I'm just waiting to see what you guys are picking up on. But can I just go back, as I really do, just the basic premise of this is supposed to be, well, if we're going to talk about sex, we're going to talk about cancel culture, how are you seeing them collide actually in this moment? You know, are women facing the brunt of this cancel culture? Are they the purveyors of it? When you said Donald Trump, Laura, but again, that goes to my question about politics too, but is it, what are women facing, I guess, that is different than men in this moment?
Well, it's very difficult to answer this question, but I think the Me Too movement was an incredible explosion. I would never thought I will live that, right? Live long enough to see what is probably a kind of revolution. So I'm very happy to witness that. That's the first thing. The thing that which struck me a lot when it happened, I was very afraid that it will be just a bubble in France and it would just, you know, 2 months later, nothing happened. And, you know, it was much slower in France than in the United States. But the Me Too movement was first global in every country, right? So it's completely different. It's really new, right? It's really revolutionary in that sense. But the second thing, which was, I think, very striking, is that every woman knew that from the beginning, right? It was not a surprise. Every man, all men were totally, you know, what? Really? So my question is, do they have a mother? Do they have a sister? Do they have a wife or cousins? I mean, I don't know. How come they didn't see? And okay, the benefit of good faith, you know, why not? But it means that they were blind for 2,000 years, right? Which is a little bit bizarre to me.
But I think there are men who are blind, and then there are men who are, you know, oblivious, of course, and then there are the men who basically want to continue to get away with whatever they've been getting away with for centuries, like you said. So I think it's really interesting when you talk about this idea of sexual harassment, sexual assault, Me Too, and the idea of sort of censorship or allowing the status quo to continue versus challenging it. And that was a huge moment, but now I feel like, is this some sort of backlash moment?
Of course, that was my next word. Of course, there is a backlash. And again, the situation in France is very different from the situation in the United States, while there are backlash everywhere. But in France, for instance, I'm again very, very surprised, or not surprised at all, that the big, you know, stories around Me Too are essentially stories of pedophilia against like Adèle Haenel was 12 when she was aggressed by the movie director. Vanessa Springora with Matzneff was 14. You know, many examples. When Polanski is attacked, it's basically to have sex.
This seems more French to me. Call me crazy, but in the U.S., it's not about pedophilia. In the U.S., it's been very much about workplace, casting couch.
Yes, but you had Larry Nassar too. You know, Larry Nassar, who was the trainer of the gymnastic team of the Olympic. That was pedophilia. But I'm talking about France. And the most unbelievable thing is that all these women, actresses, etc., or people who, of course, who has a certain visibility, otherwise you cannot be heard, are protesting, are testifying, while all the men, not one in all the affairs has recognized the fact. So they're all, so in fact, in some, you have a horde of lying whores versus an assembly of white knights. There is something weird here. No recognition, no acknowledgement of any kind. So that's, for me, backlash or not backlash, Me Too or not Me Too, there is a problem here, and a big problem. While in the United States, many men acknowledged Louis C.K., Charlie Rose, but I mean, even if they, acknowledged with difficulties, but still. So you see, and today there is a backlash in France, at least, because I know the situation better. It's like a serpent de mer, as we say. It goes like this. So there is an affair, and then poof, it collapses, and then another affair, and poof. So there's not a regular line about that, which we can regret.
This actually, there's a question from someone in the audience that somewhat relates, from Vivian. What do you think about claims based on today's reaction to sexual harassment when they pertain to events that happened many years ago, when the situation was very different toward, I guess the feeling was very different toward the way society treated sexual harassment?
So it's actually something I wanted to talk about, because I've been thinking about it a lot, because there's been two different issues lately. One, that Foucault has been accused of having raped 8 and 9-year-olds in Tunisia. And also, in the wake of the Matzneff affair with Vanessa Springora, there was a lot of discussion about this op-ed that Matzneff wrote, that a lot of people signed at the time, including Sartre and Beauvoir and Deleuze and a lot of people. And so, because I'm a Beauvoir specialist and a feminist, a lot of people, or some people at least, write to me and say, how can you think Beauvoir is a good person, knowing that she was a pedophile because she had affairs with her former student from high school? And so the story is that Beauvoir indeed had sex with some former students that were 17 at the time. And it makes me think that it's very interesting that we compare Beauvoir having sex with former students that were over 17-year-olds and Foucault allegedly, even though I think it's complicated, because we will never know. The person who made these accusations now says he hasn't seen anything himself. If you go there, people say nothing bad happened. So we'll never know. And so in a way, I even wonder why we're talking about this. But I find it very interesting that Beauvoir and in the US, Avital Ronel are taking a lot of the attacks about sexual misconduct. And I also wonder, I find it interesting that people are so happy to use these accusations against women, because at the end of the day, Sartre had sex with exactly all these women as well, because they were, one of the problem is that they were sharing these 17-year-olds, Sartre and Beauvoir, but you're always asked, why don't you cancel Beauvoir? And no one asks you, why don't you cancel Sartre? Mm-hmm. And I think what Avital Ronel did, so just it's a subtext for people who don't know. Avital Ronel is a NYU comparative literature professor who's been accused and found guilty of having sexually harassed one of her gay male graduate students. And their emails, their correspondence has been made public, and it shows that she was very sexual with him, etc. But so many people were so happy to be like, look, we're gonna use Title IX to destroy her career. In the end, her career was far from being destroyed. She had to take 1 year of leave, and she was fine at the end. But I think it's also interesting to see how happy people are to destroy women with those tools of like anti-sexual assault, anti-sexual harassment, anti-sexual discrimination.
Yeah, it must be very nice to pay back. Laura, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're, okay.
I think I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that that's true. There is this, okay, you want equality, here's your equality. Women too will be accused of sexual harassment. But I think one of the things that aligns these discussions, the pedophilia and the sexual harassment and everything, is the way that this term grooming has started coming into use, even when it's usually a woman. It's a term that comes out of studies of pedophilia, where priests or older men were grooming children for sexual purposes. And now we see this term grooming being used all the time, including in relation to adult women when there's an age difference, particularly. So one of the things that's changed in, like, I think you said 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and these cases are being kind of grandfathered in and treated and prosecuted now as if those norms and mores applied 20 or 30 years ago, is that, I mean, part of the kind of narrowing of sexual expression, I think, is that there's this incredible fear at the moment about intergenerational sex. And, it wasn't the case. I mean, even relationships where there's, say, a 10-year age difference are now looked at as close to pedophilia or incest. I mean, I think there's at the root of this a kind of fear of incest of parent-children sex. And the presumption in a lot of these discussions is that the younger person cannot be an agent, cannot be expressing desire, that it's inevitable, or it goes without saying that the older person has abused, groomed, taken advantage of the younger person. And, it was part of where I started when I was writing about this, these new dating regulations on campus, that, 30 years ago, it was the norm that professors and students dated, or it was not seen as unseemly. So part of what we're talking about here are changes in sexual culture. I mean, there's changes in, I think, how sex is thought about and discussed. And I think that affects really what sex feels like to people. It changes what feels dangerous or offensive and your own subjective reactions to it. So that's something that I think, again, I talked about what's ephemeral. It's difficult to talk about the changes in sexual culture. And in some ways, I think it's a post-AIDS HIV kind of phenomenon in which, at that point, sex, I mean, there, previous to that, the sexual revolution had made sex seem like almost healthful. It was seen as a benign kind of thing. It was fun. And I think in a certain way, post-HIV, the association of sex and death was implanted a bit more than it had been, at least in the post-sexual revolution period, pre-AIDS, post-sexual revolution. So those are some of the things, sexual culture is something difficult to talk about. But, the question, should we prosecute things that happened 30 years ago by contemporary norms? One of the issues is we now assume, and the Twitter mobs assume, and the people in the HR and Title IX offices assume that contemporary sexual mores, the mores of this moment, are true and will be true for all times and should have been true in the past, and that this is, a great achievement of progress, as opposed to having some humility, which you do if you look at history, that things change and things look different in particular historical moments. So, there's a kind of presentism about these both accusations and the way prosecutions are being conducted. And I agree with Laure, a lot of it is liability. But it's also the fact, as far as Metoo, that you have what was a grassroots movement being taken over by bureaucracies, and where the institutional interests override, any other questions.
Laure, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. So I respectfully disagree with that, because when I use, for instance, of course, sexual morals have changed, of course, and we have to pay attention to that. I agree with you. But when Placido Domingo, because I took this example, said, things were not the same in the 70s, he's right. He's perfectly right. But denying a role to a singer because she doesn't want to have sex with him is illegal. Period. Period. When Gabriel Matzneff says, in the 70s was completely different, freedom, we ask for the children, the child to have sexual relationship, of course, to serve their own desire. And pedophilia was always a crime, including when Gabriel Matzneff was going with 13-year-old girls. So there are many things that we would have to do the sexual revolution again. In other words, I think Metoo, one of the promises I hope of the Metoo movement is to do the sexual revolution again, and to reinterrogate the notion of freedom, because that was not freedom, that was like a ersatz of freedom that served, men desire. And we didn't talk about this because it's so appalling. The Tribune de Neuve, the famous op-ed Catherine Deneuve signed.
I've been trying to figure out when or if to bring that up, so please go ahead.
Okay. So signed by 100 women, French women, including Catherine Deneuve, and now it's considered that Catherine Deneuve op-ed, but she didn't write it, she signed it. Saying that men have the right to cruise and to be open about the sexual desire, etc. It's a completely retrograde text that makes that that stuck the women without any desire, but the one to accept the man desire. So it's a reading, by the way, of the sexual revolution, which is worrisome. So yeah. I think I like very much this formula of Gloria Steinem, who is saying, instead of eroticizing rape, we should eroticize equality. That would be a great project, and it would be to the benefits of women and men.
I have a question
about their relationship.
Oh, sorry,
Manon, please. With everything you just said, and I just want to say about the Deneuve letter, I wrote a piece for The Guardian about it, in which I said what that letter was trying to do was enumerate an all new right for men, as if men didn't have enough already. This right to bother, which was the substance of that letter, is like as if there should be this new right created that men would benefit by.
Can I ask you guys, I'm just always curious when women stand up like that and do such things. It makes me think of, in the US, like women getting to the boardroom and they're being in their like 70s now and being like, I don't understand why these kids are so bothered by men. Look what I did. And it feels to me like this Catherine Deneuve letter, she was basically like, we've dealt with this and it's no big deal and you're going to have to deal with it too, as opposed to like bringing up the women of the next generation and saying it doesn't have to be that way for you. I don't know. I always feel like frustration, maybe. I don't know.
So I think I wanted to talk about this because I work on women's consent to their own submission. So I was particularly interested in the op-ed, and I think there's like, I think what happened in the 70s for a lot of women is that they felt like, okay, this is sexual revolution. So if we don't want to have sex, we're accused of being frigid. If we don't want to, like, if we want to be in monogamous relationship, we're like backwards and bourgeois, etc. And so there was also a big part of the sexual revolution, at least for what I know well, which is the French context, which was not very woman friendly, where the pleasure of women was not at the center. It was mostly like this idea that you were not cool if you didn't want your partner to have sex with a lot of other women, and that was not leftist enough, etc. And so I think I agree with Laure that there's something in Metoo that is maybe the prospect of a possible egalitarian sexual revolution. But this idea that it's with HIV that people have started to be worried about sex, I think, I don't know. I'm very skeptical of this idea that sex used to be so good and that it used to be great to have sex with your professors. And I agree with Laura that there's something erotic in the transmission of knowledge, and that it's always been something that was there, and that it's not necessarily a one-side thing, and that we need to have a conversation about the eroticism of the transmission of knowledge. But I'm very skeptical of this idea that it used to be great, the sex that was had on American campuses. I really think that a lot of people were taken in power relations, and that it was not always great to have sex with old men that made you feel like they were gonna help you if you were having sex with them, etc. Like I'm not sure, and I think this whole idea of what is bad sex and what is sexual assault was at the center of the debate about the Ansari story, you know, like where, and it was very clear for me that I saw a lot of women from my mom's generation being like, okay, well, if understanding that you're in a room with some guy and you're gonna have sex with him to be left alone is rape, then we were all raped. And I think that's a big question. I think, yes, there's a change of sexual mores where I see with my sisters that are younger than me, they do think that for sure, if you're not super enthusiastic about having sex, there's a problem in the sex that is being had. And I want to add one last thing that I find very interesting is that I was among the people who brought this idea of affirmative consent in France. And people are like, that's really weird. So does it mean that you have to sign contracts? So there is this whole discussion about affirmative consent. But one thing that I find super interesting in affirmative consent is that one form it could take is that you're a woman, you're at a party and you see this guy who's really hot and you go see him and you're like, just so you know, if you're interested, for me, it's yes. Like, I'm down. I'm just telling you. But everyone is terrorized by this possibility. It looks like the woman is not going to be sexy if she does that. The man, what is left for him to do if the woman says that? Does it mean that it's going to be still interesting if he didn't have to chase a woman? So there's also this. We have very gendered ideas about sex.
But speaking about change, I mean, I think a lot of men would find that very sexy these days. But just to take a look at the questions again, because someone was thinking along these lines before we even really got there. So I'll just bring up the exact question. Could you perhaps talk a bit about how May of '68 has impacted sexuality and or cancel culture in France? So that's sort of what we're discussing now, the sexual liberation movement. But what about, yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the cancel culture funnel we've arrived at. But.
So I think in May '68, there was this big idea that was it's forbidden to forbid. So il est interdit d'interdire. That was a very, I don't know, Laure, maybe you would have better things to say about this, but I think the il est interdit d'interdire was at the core of the justification of a lot of sexual practices, with this idea that you were so like not cool in thinking that it was not okay to have sex with underage people, to not have sex with people that you had power relations with. And I think that's one of the very strong ideas in this book by Camille Kouchner when she describes what was happening. So there was this book about this political scientist and a law professor, and how he was her father-in-law, and he had her stepfather, and he had abused her twin brother. And what is very interesting is also that she describes this sort of May '68 milieu where everyone is naked all the time and where you're really not cool if you don't want, when you're a teenage girl, to make out with the friend of your dad that is there because like we're all naked and it's so cool. And so I think this whole il est interdit d'interdire played a very big role in France.
I completely agree that the word freedom is the word that, you know, is at every page of this book of Camille Kouchner. And in her parents' discourse, it was always freedom, freedom, liberty, liberty, liberty all the time. And it's echoing, and il est interdit d'interdire, it's forbidden to forbid. I think you're right, is at the core of all this problem. And it's weirdly or not weirdly echoing what the terror during the revolution, this specific, you know, period of the revolution called the terror, was calling the dictatorship of liberty. And there's the same, you know, paradox in this. It's a slogan, of course. It's not exactly, you know, an agenda.
And can I now bring in also a question that also just takes right off of this from Yanis? He says, do you think the Metoo movement is leading to a resurgence of Neo-Puritanism?
Excuse me, Lauren, I didn't understand.
Do you think the Metoo movement is leading to a resurgence of Neo-Puritanism?
No, I don't think so. But I mean, that's my opinion. I don't think so. I just want to, I mean, it's a very important question. I just want to say just one more thing about sexual revolution. I think it was an extremely important movement in many, many ways. But I think the priorities of and Manon probably knows better than me. It was a moment where the priority was abortion and contraception. Mm-hmm. And that was, you know, the trophies that feminists got. And since they got, the possibility of abortion and contraception, liberty was on its way. But it's much more complicated than that, of course. It was liberty to have sex without, you know, fearing being pregnant, which was great for men, right? But at the same time, the hierarchical relationship, the power relationship between men and women didn't move at all. So
okay,
I think
we really are
many fronts in this battle.
And we're really sort of running out of time. So I guess I'm going to ask each of you, what is one thing that you would like really hammer home at this point? Because we've, again, touched on so many different things. So what would you really like to conclude with, your final thoughts?
So I think my conclusion will be optimistic in a way, is that I really think that, yes, there are problems with Title IX, etc., but in general, we are progressively thinking about what is a sexuality that would be pleasant for everyone. And that's a good thing. And that's all that we can hope. And I think that's the result of Me Too, that suddenly women feel like their own pleasure is also on the table.
Laura?
Well, I agree with that. I think to talk about Me Too as instigating some sort of new Puritanism is too unsubtle and sloganistic. I mean, and that's what, in everything I've written, I've kind of tried to avoid those sorts of slogans and pronouncements and sort of, you know, add some nuance to the discussions. And, you know, I do think that, you know, back to the free speech issue, that to the extent that there's any kind of dampers or people are fearful because of institutional positions or whatever, or the fact that bureaucracies, whether it's Title IX offices or HR offices, have overtaken or taken over the adjudication processes, you know, there's a limitation on what can be discussed about all this. So, you know, I'm maybe somewhat less optimistic about that.
And Laure, what about you?
Well, I will go the same. I mean, a few months ago, I asked a good friend and a very famous historian called Lynn Hunt, who is a specialist of French Revolution. And I was asking her this stupid question, but at the same time, which is, the basic question of any historian who was, seeking and try to understand what makes a revolution. Because we were always, waiting for that. And I asked Lynn Hunt, I said, what do we have to do to have a revolution? And she said that the only thing that we need is hope. And I think it was a beautiful response. And personally, I have hope. And my hope is also, women are, start to be heard. I would like young men, because I think it's really a question for young people. We didn't say that, but it is addressed to people who are in their 20s now. It's so important for the future, basically. And my hope would be that young men be involved in that discussion.
Think about the year we're in, 2021. We're hopefully coming out of a pandemic soon. In the US, these political leadership has for now shifted. In Europe, things are still heading very right. And sexuality has it's all over the place, and the laws are still all over the place in campuses. You guys are.
That's very true. You're right too.
As well. Yeah. And I want to thank you all. And this has been really fascinating. My head's spinning, and I have a lot more questions, and I hope everyone out there does as well. So thank you all. I want to now just say goodbye to everyone, and please just take a listen for a moment. Marie-Monique Steckel from the president of the French Institute, Alliance Française. She's just going to give you a minute of her time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Laura, Laure, Manon, and Lorraine, for this very captivating conversation. It really is a pleasure to hear you share your views on such an important topic. If you're available this afternoon, and please join us today at 5 p.m. for an exceptional talk with actress and author Tania de Montaigne. With specialist of US history Esther Sina, they will discuss the theater adaptation of the story of 15-year-old Claudette Calvin, who refused to give her seat to a white passenger back in 1955. The play, called Noir, is available for free on FIAF website until tomorrow night. Now, if you have not watched it yet, I encourage you to do it. It is not to be missed, truly. The Transatlantic Festival will continue until tomorrow, and I hope to see many of you in the audience of the next talks. Until then, merci et à bientôt.